Hello everybody, so welcome to part 4 of building a Kingdom Death custom board. Last time we got a lot of the painting done on the board itself, highlighted the lantern there, and it's starting to look like an actual board. Now of course one of the issues that I ran into when I realized the design of this board was that having a lot of 3D objects on the board would make it really difficult for model placement. So one of the ways I was going to get around that was adding an epoxy resin to the board so that it would flush everything out. There would be an even surface across the whole board, but you would still see sort of the depth of everything below it. It would just give it an effect of like this being a swamp area. So I'm gonna go with that theme and make this sort of swamp-like, and that's what you're gonna see in this video. Now before I do that, there's some other things that I'm going to do. I want to add some antiquities like swords and shields and all this kind of fun stuff I've collected on top of the board, so I'll be gluing that down. Prior to that though, I need to turn the board over because I need to hot glue some of the sides of the board where the plywood is. This is so that when I add the epoxy resin, it doesn't sink through the board and leak onto the table below it. And also, I'm going to have to use quite a bit of epoxy resin to really get the effect that I want. And I don't want to lose any, and so because it can be quite expensive. So anyways, that's what we're going to do now. We're going to first hot glue this thing, and then I'll move on to showing you some of the different items I'm going to put on top of the board. Alright, so I've got the board turned over now, and you'll notice that on the sides here there are just some little tiny cracks in between the seams where the plywood is. And what I want to do is I'm going to run a hot glue gun across the sides there just to kind of seal those up to ensure that when I pour the resin, nothing's going to leak through to the bottom of the board here. Alright, so we have hot glued the seams there. You can kind of see down in the cracks. Just a nice little layer of hot glue just for that epoxy resin, just to make sure that it doesn't leak through to the bottom there. The gaps themselves are pretty small. And on the other side, I pretty much covered them with wood glue and sand anyways, but this is just really to make sure we don't have a leak because I'd hate to lose a lot of epoxy. So now what we'll do is we'll move on to finishing up the top of the board. I mentioned that I'm going to be putting some different objects on it, so I'll show you what those are and we'll start laying them out. Alright, so straight from China, here's all the different little miniatures, swords and lanterns, keys, different things that we're going to be placing across the board. Most of these things are kind of bronze looking already. Some of them are silver. What I'll do is I'll probably hit them with a little bit of a black ink to make them a bit dirtier. But we've got lanterns and shields and crowns and all types of stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to super glue some of these to the board. Alright, so we've got all of the little antiquities, the swords, and all that kind of fun stuff. It's on the board. It's mostly glued down. However, I didn't care so much about securing it to the wood because I'm going to be laying that epoxy resin down, and that is going to secure everything. It's going to be essentially glued in tight. So now we're going to let this dry just for a little bit, and then we are going to pour the resin. Alright, so what we have here is 2 gallons of epoxy resin. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix this, 1 part this to 1 part that, and that creates the reaction to harden up the surface and give us that clear see-through effect. So as I mentioned in the other videos, I want to add a little bit of red ink to this epoxy because I want to give it a little bit of like a blood effect, like it's a bloody red swamp. So I have this ink that I'll be adding, and we're going to put that in there, and that should give it a nice little red tint.
Okay, so you can see that the resin has been poured in there, and I went ahead and made sure that the board itself was level so that it would settle in, and everything is pretty much covered. There's a couple areas that are just outside of the resin, but I think it's okay. It's not going to affect model placement. So now we're going to just let this dry, probably going to take a few hours, and then we'll come back and check it out.
Alright, so the epoxy has dried. You can hear it there. And we got kind of like a foamy effect that we went with. It's kind of bubbly in areas too to make it look a little more swamp-like.
It did come out with a nice little red tint that does make it look like it's sort of a bloody swamp, kind of like that. Now the board itself is pretty much attached to this cardboard that I sat it upon because it did spring some leaks, but not too bad. I didn't get too much runoff, so it's pretty good. Everything is pretty much covered by this epoxy resin. There's a couple elevated places, but just gives it more depth. It's actually, I think, going to be fine for gameplay purposes. What I'm actually going to do though, I was going to make this just the last video, but I think instead I'm going to make a fifth video to do touch-ups on the side, because what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to pull all this cardboard off. It's going to stick to the bottom, so I'm going to actually sand it down, and then I'm going to paint the trim of this with a better paint that's going to cover some of these screws and the wood grain, so it looks a little bit cleaner. But anyways, this was part 4 of building a Kingdom Death Monster custom board. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to click the subscribe button and wait to check out the next one.